Welcome to Hidden Hilltop Homestead. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a tie-dye rag quilt. We are going to be making an oversized throw, and it's going to be about 60 by 60 inches. It's going to be 100% cotton, and let's get into the tools needed for this project. So you're going to need a 6-inch square ruler for your quilting squares, and I have a self-healing mat and a rotary cutter to cut out all of my squares. You're going to need 7 yards of fabric. This is cotton fabric. It's white, and we're going to be cutting the front and the back squares out of this. You're going to be cutting 288 white squares, and that will give you 144 for the front and the back. So for the batting, I'm going to be using a 5-inch ruler, and I'm going to be cutting out 144 squares from Warm and Natural cotton batting. Now you could get 3 yards if you get it by the yard, that's like a 90 to 100 inches wide, or you could get a twin size pre-cut section and then just cut all your squares out of that. So after you have all your pieces cut, we're going to start our assembly of our sandwiches. So you're going to need one of your cotton pieces. We're going to put that down, and then we're going to put the piece of batting in the middle and sandwich it on top with another piece of the cotton. So you want to make sure that you try to get it as centered as possible. And then once you have it the way you like it, you're going to pin it. I use 2 pins to secure my sandwiches. By all means, use whatever you need to. If you want to use 4 pins, if you want to use those binding clips for quilting, whatever your preferred method of pinning. And we're going to get 144 of these sandwiches made, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to move on to the next step. So here are all of our sandwiches. We are going to now quilt these squares. We're going to create an X through the middle of each sandwich. I'm going to show you how I do that here on my sewing machine. So pretty simple process here. We're just sewing a straight line across, creating an X through the middle of the sandwich. So I'm going to start with one of my corners, and I'm going to center my sewing needle. And I'm just doing the generic regular stitching that auto populates on my sewing machine. I do a couple stitches, I do a back stitch, and then I continue straight across to the other opposite corner of the square. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to stop, do a couple back stitches, do a couple forward stitches, and then pull it off. So I'm actually going to show you a cheat code here in a minute of how I do a bunch of these in a row. This really saves time and speeds up production. But I'll basically pull my piece out maybe an inch, and then I'll just start a brand new piece without cutting the thread off of the first piece, doing the same thing, a couple stitches, back stitch, sew straight across, and I'll just continue doing that until I have maybe like 10 or 12 pieces done, and then I'll pull it off the sewing machine, and then I can just easily snip in between each piece, and it just makes the sewing go faster rather than just taking one off after each line. Just a nice little time saver. So I just take my little snips and snip, and then of course you'll have to trim up the first piece and the last piece that you did. So now we're just going to go through and do the same exact thing on the opposite corners of the square, and that's going to create our quilted X. So that's all the quilting that you're doing for this blanket. It gets a little repetitive, but after you get all of your sandwiches quilted, you will then start the assembly process. So it's a little mundane, but it goes by pretty fast. I highly suggest go ahead and trimming all of your extra thread off at this point rather than doing it later when we're assembling the blanket. It just makes life 1,000 times easier. So I'll see you guys back here after you get all 144 of your sandwiches quilted, and we'll move on to the next step. Now we're going to start on the assembly of the blanket, and we're going to be building this blanket row by row. So to start building your rows, you're going to take 2 of your sandwiches, and you're going to put them technically backside together, but because you're sewing the same thing on each side, it doesn't matter. And you're going to stitch a 1/2-inch seam allowance down the side of the squares. So you're putting your 2 squares together. You're making sure your needle's set correctly, and you're going to be doing a 1/2 inch from the top to the bottom. I start with a couple stitches, do a back stitch, and then I'll continue all the way down the side and do a back stitch at the end, and then do a few more stitches and then pull it off. So we're creating a fringe, and this fringe is going to be on the front of the blanket. This is what we're looking like after your first 2 squares are together. So this is the back of the blanket, and then the front, and that's where we want the fringe piece. So after I sew all the way down, I trim my thread, and then I will cut my fringe. So I'm doing like 1/4 to 1/2 inch-ish cuts. I'm just making sure I don't cut the seam I just sewed, but we're just making little snips all the way across, so when the blanket is washed, it'll fray, and that's what we're looking for, is to create that fringy fray. That's what makes it a rag quilt. And again, just trimming up all the loose threads that I can. So that is our first 2 pieces. So you're essentially just going to keep doing this until you create a 12 block row, and then we'll combine the rows. So here we have 2 finished rows. I'm going to show you how we sew these together. You're just going to take your rows and line them up just like you did with sewing the individual blocks together. And we're just going to make sure everything's lined up. If you need to, you can pin this, and you want to make sure that your intersections are square and meeting. And then what we're going to do is fold down the fringe. So we're separating the 2 front pieces and the 2 back pieces, laying those flat, and then we're going to be sewing straight across those, which I'll show you here in a minute. Now you can do this ahead of time and pin the seams down if you need to. You can iron it if you need to. I don't use pins or anything just because, again, I've made so many of these, I'm just used to it. But you want to make sure you're doing the same 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down, and we're just going to sew the entire length of the 12 blocks, starting from the top, and then making sure we got our seams flat. Once you're done sewing these 2 rows together, you're just going to repeat the process for the other rows. If you have issues with your squares not lining up, I definitely suggest you adjust them from piece to piece. That way, one being off doesn't throw off the whole row. You can take in or even stretch out a little bit of the fabric to line them up so that they are more square. So once you're done with your row, you're going to trim the fringe just like you did with your regular squares. And I just like to kind of pull it apart and make sure everything looks good and neat, because you want your lines to line up and everything so that it's symmetrical on both the front and the back. And I just take my snips, I'll snip off the extra thread from the beginning of the row, and then I'm going to cut the same just like I did for the squares all the way down the row, and then I'll add on the next row. So after you have all your rows combined, all your fringe cut, we're going to move on to essentially the last step, and that is the finishing trim. So what we're doing is creating a edge all the way around the blanket, and we're going to be doing that with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we're going to just pick a corner of our blanket, and we're going to eyeball about a 1/2 inch from the edge. We're combining the front and the back pieces to hold in our batting. So I have my sewing machine set on the generic stitching and everything, same as I did for the rest of this blanket. And we're going to start with a couple stitches, and then I'm going to do a couple back stitches, and then do a straight stitch all the way down the side of a blanket. Now we're going to do this for all 4 sides. Very simple. It's like you've been doing this whole time, except we're just doing the single layer. We're not combining, 2 pieces together. So when I get to a fringe seam, I just lay it flat and sew right over top of it. And I'm going to do that the entire length of the blanket. I'll show you what I do when I get to the next corner. So when I get close to the corner, I hold out about a 1/2 inch from the end. I'll do 2 or 3 back stitches, and then I'll do the same exact number of front stitches, leave the needle in, pull the foot up, pivot 90 degrees, put it down, and I'll do a few front stitches, a few back stitches, and then just continue on. And you're going to do this all the way around till you get back to where you started. All right, we're back at our starting point, so I'm just going to trim off my excess thread, and then I'm going to trim the trim. So this is how I do the corners. I just leave a little box here at the end, and then I do the same thing I did for all of the other fringe. I'm doing like 1/4 inch cuts all the way across, all the way around the blanket. So now you're going to end up with this, and this is the finished product. I just have it folded up because I have a small table. So now we're going to move on to the tie dyeing section. So I'm going to lay this out on my bed. I'm going to create my tie design, and then we'll move outside and get into the actual dyeing part of it. Alright, so here is the finished blanket, and this is a California King bed, by the way, so this shows you how big the actual throw size is. But anyways, I have a tulip tie-dye kit. It's a purple and pink one. I thought this would be pretty safe. I'm just going to follow the instructions on how to create a spiral design, and basically that just means I'm finding the center of the blanket, I'm pinching it, and I'm twisting it, which I'm going to show you how I did that. What's awesome about this is you can do any type of design you want. You can go on Google or Pinterest, find all different kinds of ideas, different techniques, and truly make this, personalized to your taste. But I just wanted to go for a spiral. I felt like that would be the safest thing to do with this, and we're going to see how it turns out. So I think a little tip I could offer for the spiral design is that you want to try to keep your design flat. Like as you're twisting it, you're trying to keep the ruffles and wrinkles all the same height so that you don't have a lot of overlap and fabric being hidden underneath of other fabric. You want to have like a more open design, I guess, so that the color and water and everything can get down into all the cracks and crevices. And this does take a little bit of like tweaking. Like I'm trying to keep the ruffles organized and make sure that like I don't have the blanket like folding in on itself or missing pieces. And then after I get it the way I like it, I'm going to rubber band it to create sections, and I'll show you how I do that too. I definitely suggest double banding everything, so use 2 rubber bands everywhere that you're putting them, but I'm just going to basically band this to make it look like a pizza, and I'm creating like slices, and that's where the color is going to go. So I'm just trying to make it evenly dispersed among 8 sections, and then once we have all that done, we're going to go outside and get it set up for the color. Here is our ball of blanket ready to get dyed. So I'm doing this on my truck bed in the sunset, so it should be interesting. But first thing I'm doing is wetting down my blanket. Now this dye is meant to be used dry or wet. It does say if you have wet fabric that the dye will blend more, but it will also dilute the coloring a little bit, which I'm looking for a more pastel diluted color anyways. So best case scenario, you would pop your blanket in the washer and be able to get it wet and have it spin dried essentially, and then it'll just be a little bit damp, and then you could lay your blanket out and then create your design. I don't have a big enough clean solid workspace for that, so I decided to wet it after I got it all situated, and I'm going to soak it really good, let it drain, squeeze out as much water as I can, and then I'll move on to the actual coloring process. So I just followed the directions on the box for mixing up the color, and it's essentially just fill it up with water and shake it. So I'm going to start with the lightest color, go to the darkest, and I'm actually not even going to use the dark purple. I mixed it, but I'm deciding against it, and I'm just going to go with the light. And this is a very, very light blush pink, so I'm going to hope that that sticks and doesn't wash out. I feel like it's going to be very light when it's done. But I'm essentially just starting to color one of the pieces of the pie and then going directly across diagonally and doing that side as well. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, the same section. So I'm just kind of doing a topical coat right now, and then I'm going to come back, mix up another pack of the same color, and get in between all of the folds to make sure that there's a lot of color saturation with this. And I'm just going to do that for all 4 colors. So now that we're done with all of the color, we're going to get this wrapped up. I'm going to put some plastic wrap over it, and I'm going to leave it on this cooling rack and put it in my bathtub so that it's not going to sit in any liquid or anything that drips off. It'll be able to drain off of it and just go into the tub, and covering it with plastic will keep it wet. You're supposed to keep it damp for 6 to 8 hours, but I'm going to let this sit overnight. So we're going to rinse it out tomorrow morning. So we're going to get this wrapped up and tucked in, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. All right, it's been 12 hours, almost 13 or even 14, I'm not sure. Anyways, it is the next day, and we're going to cut off these rubber bands. We're back on the tailgate, and we're going to rinse out the blanket. So I'm just going to give it a good soak and try to get as much color out as I can, start opening it up, and then I will try to really drench it, wring it out, and give you guys a sneak peek of what it looks like before we pop it in the washing machine. Now it's looking really bright right now because I haven't got all the dye washed out and it's wet. Once I wash it and dry it, it is going to be a lot more pastel, but I think it turned out really pretty. I'm just going to go ahead and get the rest of this water wringed out to the best I can. I'm going to take it inside, put it in the washer, and I'm going to do like a full water load with just this, and I'm going to put a little bit of detergent in there. And then we'll take that out and put it in the dryer, and I'll show you guys what we got at the end. So here's our final reveal. Now I'm in the shade, so it's a little bit dark, but it turned out beautifully. I love the color. The white is not actually white, it's actually super light pink, but the swirl turned out beautiful. I think the design is pretty, and I'll show you guys the back too. It's also super gorgeous. Just as pretty as the front, so this quilt is totally reversible. I think it's a great, easy way to create a tie-dye quilt. I hope you guys love the design and the project. I hope you guys make this. I'd love to see your projects. Share them with me on Instagram, Hidden Hilltop Homestead. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.